This is Seeds Podcast, bringing you tips, conversations, and information about applied behavior analysis.
Hello everyone, welcome to Seeds Podcast. So this is season 3, and in this season, we want to share with you all how the science of ABA is applicable to so many different fields. We will be talking to various professionals and experts from different fields, and all of them share something in common, which is their background and passion in applied behavior analysis. So I'm Chuy, and I'll be your host for today. Joining us, we also have Cian, who is our co-host of the day. Hi, Cian.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Welcome to, what's that, episode number 3, I think?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, and in this episode, we will talk about organizational behavior management, which is also known as OBM. So we are very fortunate to have Leah Fennema Hall to be with us today. Leah is the director of Lux Consulting, which offers organizational performance improvement services to a variety of industries. So hi, Leah.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. And thank you for joining us today for our podcast. It's our honor to have you here with us today. Yes.
It's my pleasure, thank you.
Yes. So Leah, so without further ado, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, like your experiences, in ABA, and how do you become interested in OBM, and what's your current focus? Yeah.
Right, okay. So I've been in the field of ABA for probably about 15 years now. The first several years I started out probably the same way most practitioners begin, working with individuals and usually individuals who have a diagnosis possibly of autism or of another learning disability, potentially a dual diagnosis. And I did that primarily in a community setting. And not very long after entering the field, which now seems a little bit crazy, but at the time seemed logical, I opened my own company. And that company is still open and running today in the States. And that company works primarily, if not entirely, with adults who are dually diagnosed with an intellectual disability and some sort of other variety of behavioral challenge. So after doing that for several years, it occurred to me that I spent a lot of time not just working on my business and enjoying working on my business, but I realized I fielded quite a lot of phone calls from other people who owned a business in the same industry. And they would ask, how I ran certain parts of my business, how I managed people. And of course, I had no idea what I was doing. So I just told them what I did. Early in my career, although I knew what OBM was, and I did take a course in it at university, I didn't take much time to look into it until all of a sudden I realized that it might be the bit that I really enjoy about what I did. I love working with clients, and I still enjoy getting involved in those cases in the States. So it wasn't that I didn't love that, but it was that I seemed to be gravitating towards working on the business as opposed to in the business. So I found myself a mentor in OBM. I was really fortunate to be able to do that. It's not an easy thing to find, at least it wasn't then. And, I started out reading books and journal articles and trying things within my own business. And before long, I realized that I probably needed to get some experience outside my business and outside that industry. So I did a little bit of work with a quality consulting company. So they consult on sort of processes and quality, for a variety of industries. I often say they had no idea what to do with me because of my background, and I didn't know what to tell them to do with me either, which is just the truth. So, but I did enjoy my time there, and I think it made me realize just how applicable what I knew was. What I didn't know was about businesses and how they were structured and what good looked like and all of that stuff. But of course, what I did understand is human behavior. So after a while doing that, just by complete chance, I happened to meet a lovely lady who'd been working in aviation at the time for 20 plus years, and she had just left a job, wasn't sure what she wanted to do, and I knew I needed a change from that quality consulting company. And I said, well, and this is after I'd moved to the UK, by the way, and I was pretty new in the UK at the time, so I thought, why not start another company? So Sarah, who was that woman, and I started what is now Lux Consulting. And the vast majority of the work that we do is in aviation, although we definitely now recently have done quite a bit more in other safety critical industries. But fortunately, Sarah knew the subject matter of that industry, and I knew the human behavior stuff, as did Sarah, because she's a human factors expert. So same subject matter, slightly different philosophy and science, but we tend to both be systems thinkers. So yeah, that brings you up to today.
That's really interesting. Like, how your journey started from like I would say the typical work environment for like or ABA practitioner or BCBA, and then you ended up aviation and you open up your own company and all that stuff. I think that's really, really cool. And it's like, wow, fascinating. So now I think our next question is that if you would mind to tell us like actually what is what is OBM? So what is OBM, and how is it different from ABA, or is it different from ABA? And also, is OBM the same as like industrial organization psychology? Like, what makes them different?
So that's a good question. I would say, and this would probably not be a popular opinion, but I would say OBM is ABA, because ABA is applied behavior analysis. And so it is the science of behavior, and it's applied, right? So it is applied behavior analysis. However, when we say applied behavior analysis, we generally mean working with an individual. And when we say OBM, or organizational behavior management, we usually mean applying the same principles to individual and group performance. And here's the key bit: in the context of a larger organization or system. So the reality is, if you're in ABA, you're working within the context of a larger organization or system, but you may or may not be paying any attention to it. In OBM, we work in that organization or system on purpose, and we will probably be looking to have an impact on the behavior of more than one person. So that's probably your biggest difference. So in terms of subject matter, it's very much the science of human behavior. It's also very much systems analysis, right? So those two fields work incredibly well together. And like I said, even if you work with individuals, it's incredibly beneficial to understand systems analysis, because it will have an impact on individual behavior. But the difference being, you're only trying to modify the behavior of one individual versus several, or the entire system itself. Now, interestingly enough, IO psychology, or industrial and organizational psychology, would probably also say that it's the scientific study of human behavior in organizations and the workplace. Yeah, so that sounds the same. But the difference, of course, would be the underlying science. So psychology is obviously going to be a collection of a bunch of different ways of thinking about human behavior, potentially. Whereas OBM is single science, right? The single theory of human behavior, which is, of course, based on Skinner's analysis of human behavior. So that's the difference. One's a collection, one is just the one science.
I think that's really interesting. Like, as someone who doesn't have any background in like business or like, IO psychology, like I wouldn't be able to to gauge the difference between like OBM and IO. So I think that makes a really clear definition of these two different fields, you know, and how it's similar yet different from each other. And I really think it's interesting when you point out that, you know, as an ABA practitioner, you know, and ABA is the same as OBM, but often we look at the behavior of one individual, but OBM looks at the system as like at the whole. So I think that's a really interesting and unique way of look at things that I suppose it's something that we actually never, like what you say, we never pay attention to it, that actually working in like a company or working with a family or teachers is actually like a huge system of like human management itself.
Yeah, and I think people could be easily confused that actually the difference might be the application environment, right? Or the thing to which we're applying the science. So some people might accidentally be under the impression that ABA means working with people with autism.
Right.
And they might accidentally believe that OBM means consulting for a particular type of business. But actually, it's just the difference between individual and collection of individuals. Yeah, so individual or organization.
Could I maybe kind of dig a little bit deeper on like the system analysis? So Leah, you mentioned in OBM, you know, you're looking at the, I'm sure you're looking at individuals and a collection of, you know, a group of people. And then in, say, for example, in like an early intervention program, you know, with young learners with autism, like how would this look like if we were to, you know, apply this system analysis in that kind of setting? Or is it appropriate? You know, I just kind of want to see what it looks like if we were to do that in this, you know, this different, completely different area, different practice.
Yeah. So how would we think about it if we're dealing with an individual?
Right.
Right. Well, it depends on that individual and the system that they exist in. So let's say you're working in a clinic, and your point of focus is that individual. Well, that individual, whether they're an adult or a child, let's say they're a child because it's probably familiar, that individual exists within their own system, right? So they go home after they go to that clinic, right? And that's another system. There are, you know, there's a parent or parents, there are maybe other people living with them, there are maybe siblings living with them. Those individuals are all going to have an impact on their behavior. They go to school probably. That school, the people in the school, the policies in the school, those are going to have an impact on their behavior. So just as a for instance, off the cuff, what if you're working with an individual in a clinic and you want that individual to ask for something using words, you know, or using some form of communication instead of something that's a little bit less adaptive, right? Maybe, you know, hitting someone or to get their attention. You can work on that in the clinic. And you might have it, you know, beautifully done in the clinic to where that child is now able to use words to ask for things and is able to get their needs met. Well, if you don't address the other parts of that system, right? So what if the kid goes to school and in school, the teacher doesn't give them time to ask for something using words? The impact that that's going to have on their behavior is that at a minimum, they're not going to be asking for things in school anymore or at any stage. Yeah. And that behavior may or may not generalize to their home environment. Probably not unless you address that part of the system, right? So you make sure that whoever it is that lives with the child is going to encourage them to use their words to ask for things. So these are the elements of the system. So those are human elements, right? Maybe look at a policy element. What if in school, the policy is if you hit somebody, then you get sent out of the classroom. Yep. The impact that will have is, who knows what that impact will have on that kid's behavior. Maybe they won't like being sent out of the room. Maybe they will like being sent out of the room. Yeah, but that's the impact of just the policy itself. And maybe the teacher agrees or doesn't agree, but it doesn't matter, because if he or she is going to follow that policy, then it's the impact almost of the policy. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So, and it kind of depends, you know, on the settings, and just really looking at I mean, good practice should be doing that. Like, I think any, you know, anyone that's working with, in this case, the child, should be really looking at beyond, you know, the child, but also what's in the environment, whether it is people or whether it's, you know, the policy, you know, so on and so forth. So I, you know, thank you, Leah. That was really clear. I kind of want to understand.
But also,
that.
so also zoom out, right? So we talked about things that are part of that, the more zoomed in bit of the system, but there are also really important things that are at a much higher level. So what about something like culture? Yeah, culture is going to have an impact on that individual. The economy can even have an, you know, federal regulations, for example, in the United States is going to have some impact on how much time you as a therapist will be able to spend with that individual. So there's really no limit to how broad or how narrow those systems can be that have an impact on someone.
So interesting. So much to think about, I guess.
It is a lot.
You know, it's not just that one kid, but it's, you know, everything that revolves, you know, around the kid. And and I think maybe that's why everybody should know a little bit of OBM, regardless of what they do, right?
I think personally, for me, it was a pretty clean transition between working with individuals and organizations. But what's been interesting is, because I still have the company in the States that works with individuals, I will often speak to the lovely women who are running that company about cases. And I find that there are things that I notice and that I think to ask about cases now that I never would have thought of when, you know, sort of before I'd been working in the organizational realm, if you will.
So cool.
Yeah, I think that I just want to, because since we are on the topic, so I just want to continue with the conversation a bit. So in your opinion, how can OBM, you know, help with ABA services, you know, not just on individual, but like say services like maybe a company itself, or like, you know, the application, or so how can OBM help with, like, you know, the ABA services in general, as a whole?
So many ways, in so many ways. So again, if you think about what are the levels of systems, right? Then the sort of the science of OBM could apply to pretty much anything that has an impact on an ABA organization, big or small. So on a smaller level, OBM principles, you know, could be applied to the performance management of the people working in that organization. It could be applied at a, you know, a slightly large, it could be applied at a huge level, at the regulation level, right? So that organization is obviously going to be probably working within, maybe if you are in the States, as private insurance. If you're in the UK, these are the only systems I know very well. You may or may not provide services for the NHS. So depending on what happens there, that's going to have an impact on the organization. You know, what people are accustomed to, I think, seeing OBM in ABA organizations is the management of people. Yeah, so maybe the way that we structure our organizational system, maybe the way that we reward our employees. So yeah, at any size of that system, you can use OBM for an ABA organization. Something that's popular as a concept in OBM is performance-based pay, which essentially means you pay someone in equal measure to their contribution to the organization, right? So if they do things that, and I'm not recommending this at all, by the way, I would not recommend this, but for example, if they work maybe maybe they turn their things in on time and they're able to be billable on time, or maybe they work more hours, then maybe they get paid more because they're making the business more money. So there's lots of ways to look at the way that we motivate people in the context of an organization.
Yeah, I think that makes really good point, because I think, in ABA field, that it's one of the common issue with like ABA practitioner is burnout. Like, lots of people getting burnt out from their work, and I think it's the same across all fields as well as not just ABA. And I think having some ideas or knowledge on OBM, and then the way how can we manage how can we manage our employee, and how can we manage their schedule, or what can we do to actually help to make things better for them. So I think that's where we need input from OBM, because like as much as we
there's lots of ways to look at that, and there are things that you would commonly see in OBM as an intervention, and there are things that start to get outside what we think of as the realm of OBM. So you mentioned burnout, right? Behavior analysts aren't exactly schooled in the concept of fatigue, right? That would be more of your IO psychology. But behavior analysts can certainly understand fatigue and the impact of fatigue in behavioral terms. And what behavior analysts are sort of famous for is data, right? So if you're concerned about burnout, it shouldn't be very difficult to prove that having a burned out workforce leads pretty directly to subpar services, right? And that could be measurable in a lot of ways. If you work with individuals with maybe challenging behavior, I think what you would probably see is the more burned out your workforce, probably the more incidents you have, right? Because people are going to fail to be proactive, and they might find themselves being a bit tactical and reactive. So it wouldn't be difficult to prove using the sort of data methods that we're accustomed to, that actually having a burned out workforce is quite dangerous. It also would help you to address the problem. So what if accidentally, it's funny, this is going to come full circle. What if accidentally you motivated people to work too much, right? Maybe you didn't put a cap on the number of hours that they were able to work. And maybe you did have a really strict performance-based system where, if you work this much, you get paid this much. If you work this many hours, you get paid this much. So people would be motivated, right? You've created a system that motivates burnout at that stage. Or maybe you just have one individual working with a handful of individuals, and that's too much for them. So you might accidentally create a system that leads to burnout. But in every human system, there are various little switches you can flip on and off to see what works and what doesn't work. So maybe one of the switches we try is we've got therapists working with sort of 5 people at a time. Maybe if we turn it down to 3, let's see what happens, with the quality of outcomes for those individuals. Or let's see what happens with something that would be very directly related, which is absences, right? Do we have an absence problem? Why might we have an absence problem? Could it be because we're burning people out, right? And if we stop burning them out, will our absences decrease? So it's all a matter of looking at, the typical science, cause and effect, prediction and control.
That's really, like, I really like the way you explain things, because now that you makes it really clear that how the principle of ABA actually can applicable to, like, in terms of like human performance management, the sort of things. Because you talk about, like, motivation, you talk about, like, let's play a little bit of control on, like, the behavior, which is similar to what we do, when we do with our client, let's look at that. So that brings me to the next question. So it seems like the understanding of, like, behavioral principles really help, in terms of the of your job, in terms of, like, OBM, in terms of, like, all this. So could you give some example of, like, how do you, like, principles like reinforcement, punishment, or extinction, how does those look like in OBM settings, like,
Just the same as they do in every other setting. So speaking of absences, this will be a good transition. I just had a call yesterday with a lovely client who, when I met them, The policy they had in their organization was very punishment-based, right, around absences. So if you were absent, and of course it was not an approved absence, right? It was maybe a no-call, no-show, or maybe I called at the last second to say, you thought I was going to be here, you planned for me to be here, but I'm not going to be here. What they had done is they quote unquote gave them points, right? You don't want points. So if you gained so many points, you got fired, all right? You were sacked. So if you were absent, I want to say it was 7 points, yeah? And you could be sacked. Well, that's a punishment intervention. It is only a punishment intervention. And what do we know about punishment interventions? They're really going to decrease behavior, we think. The intention was that we were decreasing absences. The reality is we were actually decreasing people showing up to work, which may or may not have been related to the fact that you received the points upon showing up to work. But so it was really quite a risky move to recommend to the CEO of this organization that we stop that. Right? Because they feel like, actually, if I don't give them points, then they're going to run riot, you know, and their absenteeism was absolutely atrocious. It was like 30+%, which is, you know, in any industry, that's pretty obscene. And I said, okay, well, being the scientist that I am, I said, look, why don't we just try changing one thing at a time? Yep. Let's just remove the point system and see what happens. And fortunately, the CEO is a very trusting individual. So they allowed it. They said, okay, well, let's see. And I'm quite certain that they thought this is going to go horrendously wrong, and then we'll show her. But that's fine. So we pulled the point system, and instantly absences dropped. Instantly. They went from 30% down to 20%. Still not good, but much better than it was, because that 30% was a very, very stable sort of level. It had been sustained for years. So the fact that it had gone immediately down to 20% is pretty stunning. The next thing that we did was add in a little reinforcement procedure, which was insanely simple. All we did was make sure that when people showed up on time, their supervisor just said thank you, right? So they showed their face. They said, hey, thanks, you know, I've noticed you've been out a bit lately. I really appreciate you being in. Here's why I appreciate you being in. It's helpful, blah-de-da. And then we knocked off another, I think it was about 5%, right? So we went from 30 to about 15, adding that in, and we're monitoring it now to see what that data does over time. We're going to give it a couple more weeks. And at that stage, we'll look at what else we might be able to do to continue to reduce the absenteeism, although it's getting pretty close to what's industry standard. So it may or may not continue to move down quite as impressively as it has so far. But there's one example. Another one is, this is one of my favorite programs that I talk a lot about. We have what's called the Safety Leaders Program at airports, at a couple of airports. So what that means is so in an airport setting, you have lots of individuals working on the apron or the ramp or the tarmac, whatever it is you call it, depending on where you live. And those individuals actually don't work for the airport usually. They work for lots of different companies. But the airport is responsible for safety at the airport, even though they don't write the paychecks of the people working at the airport. So try solving that, right? From not a behavioral standpoint, it's really quite difficult, because the way we usually, I hate to use this term, but control people would be, you know, by punishment or by threatening. Well, you can't do that if they don't answer to you and you don't write their paycheck. So they were really they were out of ideas. They tried taking what's called an airside pass. So they tried taking their ability to work there. Not surprising that didn't work. They just started firing a lot of people, and their turnover was ridiculous. Yep. Anyway, and they would fire them for behaving in a way that was unsafe. So our idea, we called the Safety Leader Program, and it meant training lots of individuals who work at the airport, not for the airport, on how to be a safety leader. And all that means is really simple. It's deceptively simple. Is if you're a safety leader, you are trained to stop someone who's behaving unsafely. Yeah. If, you know, it doesn't matter if you are a ground handler, this is your first day on the job, and the CEO of the airport walks out and his or her high vis is undone, which is a dangerous situation because it means we can't see you, right? Then you have to stop the CEO and say, I'm sorry, sir or ma'am, I think you'll find that when your high vis is undone, it's really quite unsafe. Here at the airport, we have agreed to do up our high vis. So there is that bit, right? So it's literally just providing a consequence, whereas before there was not. That's a punishment intervention. So of course we couldn't do that alone. Well, it could be a punishment intervention. The other half of that, which is probably the more impactful half, is we started telling people that when they see things happening that are safe, they are to go and provide some sort of recognition or praise. They take the badge number of the individual who's doing something safe, and that person gets some variety of reinforcer, whether it's public praise via a shared WhatsApp group, a safety recognition. You can earn all sorts of cool safety leader gear like water bottles and things that are helpful to have in an airport. Or even gift vouchers and stuff. And the program has been so incredibly successful that in the airport that's been doing it the longest, they actually had several weeks in a row of absolutely no incidences at all, which is, it sounds simple, but actually in that setting with so much going on, it's actually unheard of. And it had never happened in the airport's history. So, and that's just as a direct result of modifying those consequences that people encounter when they're at work. It's the exact same people that were there before. You know, nothing else has changed other than just this one intervention. So those are, you know, completely simple programs, familiar concepts, and just applied in an organizational setting.
Okay, this is like, you know, the nerdy side of me wanting to know. You know, the first example that you gave us, Leah, you talked about, what was it? I think when they come in early, when the staff come in early and have someone come to say, oh, thank you, you know, for coming in, you know, and all that. So how do you measure that part? Like, how do you know that it is that part that is actually, you know, reducing the number of absences? Yeah, like, it's just like for us, you know, working in, you know, the early intervention kind of you know, context, it's, you know, just collect data, but then like it's hard for me to imagine what it looks like in like an organization, huge organization.
You have to be very clever in an organizational setting. That's not to say you don't have to be very clever about the way you collect data with individuals. You certainly do. You know, not everybody loves taking data, right? As much as I do. But in an organization, I think, because again, it's not just one person you need taking data, it's the supervisor on the shift of that section. You're talking about quite a number of individuals you need taking data. So the extent to which you can automate that data collection, you are really a lot better off. Some of the data we use for that was already taken. So like I said, the absenteeism data, did they show up or did they not? Were they late or were they on time? That data has been taken for ages, and it is quite accurate because they need it for pay. so they're fully motivated to take that data for me. Now, the supervisors providing the praise statements, it's the honor system. You do have to trust them, but they do have to write down, you know, sort of who it is that they're paying attention to, you know, who are the people that are consistently late. They do have to write down giving praise statements to those people. On the same sheet, right? So this is reducing response cost. On the same sheet that they record data for, in this case, it was a manufacturing setting. So they keep track of, we'll call them widgets, how many widgets they produce in a shift, right? So on that same sheet of paper, it says, were they on time? If they were on time, did you say thank you or not? And quite frankly, sometimes the answer is not, but that's okay. We know intermittent reinforcement works too, as long as it comes later, and we're really good about the reinforcement in the beginning, which is in an organizational setting, unless they were willing to pay me to be there every single day, I have to hope that when I tell them it's very important to provide lots of praise early in this program, and then you can spread it out a bit more later, I have to make sure that that happens, right, to the extent that I possibly can. And if I'm not there, there's a lot of trust involved. So there are a lot of other, here's a system, there are a lot of other people I need to train to make sure that that's happening when I'm not there. So that means that I can tell the supervisors to do it. I can give them that data sheet as a bit of a job aid to remind them. But I also have to make sure that the production manager, who is their supervisor, goes to check those data sheets. And I have to make sure that their boss makes sure that they checked the data sheets. And I have to make sure that their boss, do you see what I'm saying? So we put all these checks in place to make sure that sort of everyone's motivated to do what they have to do to make the program work. Because if we didn't, then we're gonna, what's the systems have one of the basic principles of systems is entropy, right? If you don't touch it, it's gonna fall apart. If you don't consistently put energy into a system, it's gonna fall apart. And that definitely will happen if you don't put those checks in, right? If I just did a nice training and I said, I think you'll find if you tell people thank you, then they'll keep doing what you said thank you for. Well, that would be a lovely, warm, fuzzy feeling they would leave with, and then they would do nothing different. So without those, you're a little bit stuffed.
I think that's, yeah, after listening to all these examples, and how we need to train people in to doing the things that we want, in a in the typical settings, or not in a early intervention, or working with children with autism. So I think that's that makes me think. I think as an ABA practitioner, we are really good at delivering our programs. We are really good at working with our clients and all. But oftentimes we are, it's only my personal opinion, oftentimes we are actually not really good at adapting our skills to the people around us. So, when you talk about praising the employee when they are there on time, giving the reinforcement, it sounds really simple, and it's something we do all the time with our client, with our children. But when you ask us to do it with our colleague, with our, the people around us, it's oh, okay, I never thought of that, but yeah.
And it makes you feel funny. This is something that I haven't thought about in a while, but I remember when I first sort of started working in organizations, this really hit me pretty hard. And that is, when you're working with individuals, if you do training for somebody that's important to that individual, we often just ask them to do it, right? So if we're just here, do this and it'll all be fine. Let me explain to you how to do it. If you're a good behavior analyst, then you do a little bit of behavioral skills training, you make sure they know how to do it, and off you go. And you don't give a lot of thought into, quite frankly, how awkward that makes them feel, right? Because even if it's their own child, it's actually quite unnatural. It clearly wasn't their habit. Otherwise, we wouldn't be intervening, right? To just, something as simple as providing a reinforcing statement for doing something that they, and here's something I hear all the time, think they should have been doing anyway, right? That is, when you begin to ask, for example, a manager to provide a praise statement to someone, to their supervisee, chances are really good that you're going to get an argument, right? Because these people are fundamentally different than the individuals often. This is an overgeneralization, but often the people we're working with, if it's, you know, their child, very often they're very willing to comply because they've got a lot of skin in the game, right? They really need and want this individual that they love to do something, you know, that makes their life easier, that improves their quality of life. If you're a manager and we're talking about your supervisees, you may be less motivated, right? You may not care as much how they experience work. And you may be under the impression that most people are under, which is their behavior is their responsibility and my behavior is mine. So if they're not doing their job, that's on them, even though I'm their manager. Even though I've been given the explicit responsibility to make sure they do their job. So telling people, and I remember one of my favorite of all time was also in a different manufacturing setting, and it was a man who'd sort of, you know, been in charge of what was a tire making factory for probably nearly as long as I'd been alive at the time, and he said, oh, you know, people have come in here before telling me to tell people good job. And, you know, I am not going to do it. It's a terrible idea. And I said, well, how would people that work for you know that they'd done something that you thought was good? How would you know that? And he goes, well, I'd probably say something like, you know, that's not terrible. And I was like, great, do that. Well, I can do that. Well, will they know that it means that they've done something right? So we had to shape that behavior for him, right? We had to start with just don't yell at them all the time, you know, maybe yell at them less when they're doing something good. And then we moved it to maybe tell them that it wasn't terrible. And then we moved to a thank you, you know, but for him, that was meeting him where he was. But it was all because what I was asking him to do that we would just take for granted, for example, a parent, there was not the same motivation there. So you definitely had to be a little bit more conscious about motivating people to do what they need to do. And you also have to do quite a bit of, and you should do this with individuals as well, of course. But instead of just saying, here's the issue, here's the program, off you go, it's a very collaborative process. It's, here's the issue, would you agree? Here's the data, here's how we know. Here are some options, right? We could do this, we could do that, we could do the other thing. If you do this, it might look like this. If you do this, it might look like this. If you so on, which would you like to do? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so have them choose which program they would prefer. Oddly enough, this was the program that he did prefer until it came down to what that really looked like. But anyway, so collaboration and program creation is incredibly important, whether it's an individual or an organization. But perhaps you have a difference in motivation from time to time there.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because it's almost like shaping up the culture of the organization, shaping up the culture of saying good things to people. Don't yell at people because it may not work.
Yeah, there's a lot of shaping. I think shaping is so underrated, isn't it, in behavior analysis in general? And that absolutely is, I think, the same with individuals and organizations. But when you're talking about something as big and broad as a culture, you don't really have many options other than shaping, do you? You're not going to go from A to B overnight. It is actually impossible. So a good example of that is there's a concept in safety critical industries called a just culture. I like to think of it as kind of a learning culture. So when people make a mistake, you make sure that you have an understanding of why the mistake was made. You don't instantly punish them unless sort of that it was malicious, right? Or it was sabotage. So it's sometimes referred to as a no blame culture. So if I'm maybe I'm a ground handler at an airport and I accidentally run into an airplane with a vehicle, if it was an accident and if I report it, a just culture means you're not going to be punished. You're going to be thanked for reporting. We're going to try to understand how this happened. And it's pretty necessary to make sure that people report things. And it's really quite necessary to make sure that the organization learns, right? Why do things happen? Depending on where you are in the world, it is more or less difficult to convince the people who are making these policies that this is a good idea. And in no part in the world is it easy. So if you damage a multi-million-pound-dollar aircraft, someone's going to want to fire someone, right? Even if it was an innocent mistake. And in the past, that's what would happen. But what we obviously try to move towards is that no blame or just culture. But it is not as easy as just saying, today you fire people and tomorrow stop it, right? So there are bits of the concept that you might have to sort of be okay with not being accepted early on, and that's the shaping process. So maybe the only thing you can convince them out of the gate is the learning aspect, right? Maybe they're going to fire them and there's nothing you can do about it, right? And that kind of kills our little behavior analyst heart because it just doesn't make any sense. But maybe that's the law. Maybe it's a policy and you can't change it. But what you can change early on is, can we at least do an investigation to figure out why that happened? And then what might happen is they'll realize that, they are responsible for the fact that they accidentally ran into the airplane. And then maybe later on, we think about changing our policies. But culture especially is a shaping process. Yeah.
Wow, that's really, I think, again, that's another point that, especially for myself, I've never thought about it. Like what you say, shaping is really underrated. And when we talk about shaping, it's almost like, okay, let's shape how you hold a pencil. Let's shape how you do certain behavior. But it's not like, oh, let's shape the culture of the whole organization. Yeah, and these are the things you encounter. So yeah.
Just successive approximations, right? Is it better than it was yesterday? Great. Reward that, move on. Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard. It can be really hard, I think, for a couple of reasons. One is if you're used to working with individuals, especially small humans, right? Then you can get away with things like extinction without, a good reinforcement component. You can get away with the effects of doing, just differential reinforcement with, as opposed to shaping. It was probably a lesson that I learned working with adults, honestly, because if you have an adult who's going to become violent, right? If you were to use a differential reinforcement procedure, you're going to have to think outside the box, right? You're going to have to shape that behavior, whether you like it or not. And the same with animals, honestly. Probably one of the best experiences of my undergraduate career was taking a class where part of the requirement was to train an animal. You have to use shaping with animals. You don't have to, but they don't speak. They don't communicate with you in ways that you generally understand. So shaping is pretty critical. But I took that into my work in organizations. I prefer shaping if I'm working with an individual, and I prefer shaping at the organizational level because it kind of reduces a lot of the not desirable aspects, right, that come with a more sudden shift for people. It's an easier sell at the higher levels, right? We're just going to change it this much. What do you think about that? I guess we can handle that. It's sustainable, right? It requires a lot less momentum in terms of response cost. Yeah, shaping is underrated.
Yeah. So I think I have one last question for you before we end this, unless Cian has something else that she wants to ask and she can add on. So and I think you are the only OBM practitioner in the UK at the moment. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
I don't know. I'm sure there are other people doing something like OBM and or OBM itself. I just haven't come across them. You know, it's a reasonably large country. I'm sure someone else is out there who is doing OBM or thinks they're doing OBM.
Yeah.
I'd be surprised if I was the only one. And there are a lot of people that do part of their work as what we would call OBM, and sort of most of their work is not OBM. But yes, I might regret saying this later because I might remember someone else, but I might be the only person I know that's all I do. That's my full-time job.
Yeah, and with the title of BCBA as well, who is, you know, doing OBM work. Yeah,
strange combination. And if I'm brutally honest, the only reason I'm a BCBA doing OBM is not because I need to be a BCBA, and I don't have it on my business card. And if I asked any of my clients what is a BCBA, they would look at me with a blank stare, because it's not required. It's really not. But I worked really hard for it. And it was very critical that I had it when I worked with individuals. So I keep it.
Yeah.
For now.
For now. So where would you like to see, I don't know, the growing of this field, you know, the growing of OBM, or what would you like to, what would you like more people or like more BCBA to know about OBM? Because now that we talk about the importance of OBM and how it will benefit we all, you know, regardless to our client or our organization or the culture as a whole. So what would you like to see in the future direction of this field?
Well, I think what I would like to see, not just for OBM, but for behavior analysis in general, is a much wider scope of practice, right? So we have a fair number of individuals, mostly in the US, but they're doing only a few things. So there's not, you know, many people believe that ABA is synonymous with treatment, you know, for autism. And I think that's a real shame. It's wonderful that we have so many behavior analysts that can work with individuals. It's an amazing skill set and a huge need. However, there's an enormous world outside with untold number of other industries. And I think, you know, the reality is, in terms of systems, if you go to university to become a behavior analyst, your available job options are quite likely to be pretty much entirely in that realm. Yeah, so it's not, you're looking at having to create something fundamentally different. So there's no receiving system, right, for an OBM graduate that I'm aware of, certainly not outside the States. Whereas if you know, your experiences with individuals with autism, send out a couple of emails, you're quite likely to get a job pretty quickly. There is no such thing in OBM, and lots of people will contact me and say, you know, where can I go to get experience? And the answer is nowhere that I'm aware of, right? Lots of times people are given the advice to try it in their own organizations, and that's very good advice. You will learn that way. Unfortunately, that won't expand our field. Hopefully it will build a skill set that will allow you to expand our field, but I have a real hard time figuring out a way to expand, like, let's just take OBM as an example, our field outside of entrepreneurship. So because OBM doesn't exist as a job unless you create that company, right? There's a tiny number of OBM companies in the world. They cannot house all the people that want to work in OBM. So as I see it, your options are two options. One, go work as something that's not called an OBM practitioner, and that would be amazing, and we need lots of people to do that. Go work in HR, learn HR, and take your behavior analysis knowledge with you. Go work as a process engineer and take your knowledge of human behavior with you. Or, you know, any number, go work as a safety consultant, right? But take your knowledge of human behavior with you, and drive those fields forward that way. Or, do something completely unrelated. Go work in consumer behavior, in marketing. Oh, sales and marketing are enormous areas where people could benefit from knowing more about human behavior. So I'd love to see people do that. But that will not open the world's eyes to OBM. So if that's something we want, we have to have somewhere to send people for experience. And unfortunately, that means generating a demand that does not exist today. There's a huge demand for management consultant services, which is kind of what I do. There's a demand for our skill set. It's huge. They just don't know what it's called. So if we want people to ever one day, right? If we want a CEO to think, how can I fix this problem? I know I'm going to find an OBMer. If we ever want that day to happen, we need people to start businesses. We need entrepreneurs to go out, hang a shingle, as they say, and start spreading the word of, I'm doing this way. It's successful. I can prove it with the data. And by the way, the science is called OBM. The exact same way that we did it with ABA, right? The same way we did it with autism treatment. How did it become so popular? Because we proved that it can work, right? Because we had the data to support it. And that's why it found its way into things like regulation. That's why people will fund it. Until we can build that demand, until we can generate the demand for those services, there's not going to be a really good reason for creating huge university programs to churn out OBM practitioners. Does that make sense? So I hope I'm wrong. I hope someone has a more brilliant idea. I really do. But I don't see any way around it other than growing the demand externally and then growing the resources to fill that demand. I do hope it happens. It's not that I'm not working on it. I really am.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think it's like what you say, ABA is so popular, but oftentimes it's also all very limited to just like one population and all. So yeah, but I think we are getting there. I mean, we are all at our starting point. We are all trying to disseminate ABA to use it to apply to different fields, and we are all there. So hopefully we will live to the day where we can see, OBM to become like a popular field and all that. Yeah.
Yeah, there are plenty of exciting things happening as well. In the UK, we're, because we're migrating away from the BCB, in the UK, we're starting a whole new credentialing system. And one of the really cool things about that system that we're creating now is we're making it intentionally not specific to autism. So the sort of the competencies you'll have to prove that you have, none of them will be specific to working with an individual with any diagnosis. So, I hope that two major things are achieved with that. Number one, that we don't have people that are just gathering a load of skills and don't understand the other underlying science. And the other thing is, that's a much broader education, right? It can be because it's not application specific, hopefully this makes it easier for people to gain that skill set and then understand that they can gain another one, whether that is animals, whether that is working with businesses, whether that is whatever else it is, sales. It's having those two skill sets that allow you to have something to apply the science to. So I think it's a major step in the right direction, making sure that the field doesn't accidentally narrow itself. It at least gives the opportunity for it to expand.
To be flexible, I think.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's really great, and thanks for sharing all your experience, and I think all your explanation, you makes it really clear, and how can we apply ABA in the OBM field, and then how can we apply ABA in shaping up the culture, to manage people, to talk to other people or to praise people. So I think that's really great. And thanks for all your input for today, Leah. I'm sure the audience will benefit a lot from today's episode as well, and in learning, the dissemination of ABA.
Yeah, thank
My
you,
pleasure.
Leah. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I enjoyed it so much. I can't, like, my mouth just, I'm just smiling the whole time. It just, it's, I think one thing, the kind of emotion, that I got when I'm just listening to you is just hopeful. It's like the signs that we have, and there's just so much you can do with it, right? And I think when you talk about OBM, and how you apply the signs, to improve whatever it is that you're trying to improve within the organization, it's always so positive. It's always so optimistic, like, hey, we could do this, we could totally change this. Or like, oh, instead of, oh, this is not going to work, this person is not the right person, for the job. I think it's like, there's just so much you can do, it's just, what are you going to do and how you're going to do it. So that's, it makes me so happy listening to you. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's my pleasure.
So thank you so much, Leah, and thank you everyone for listening to the podcast. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. And that was Leah Fennema Hall sharing with us the application of behavioral science in organizational behavior management. We thank Leah once again for joining us at Seed Podcast.